In just 72 hours, a black female attorney sent shockwaves through the entire U.S. Supreme Court. She didn't hold political sway. She had no establishment backing. But Jasmine Crockett possessed something they all feared most: proof. And when she played a secret recording during a press briefing, Chief Justice John Roberts had nowhere left to run. What gave one woman the strength to stand alone and shake a powerful institution to its core? Forcing resignations. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The envelope was plain. No return address. No insignia. Just thick ivory paper, its corners frayed like it had passed through too many hands too quickly. Jasmine Crockett eyed it warily. Her instincts kicked in. In Washington, silence doesn't mean calm. It signals danger. She shut her office door and slid a letter opener shaped like Lady Justice's sword beneath the flap. A single sheet fell out. One page, but heavier than any legal brief. Her eyes locked on the heading: International Legal Fellowship Summit, London 2022. Her pulse spiked. There, bolded in black ink, were names that never should have appeared side by side. Chief Justice John Roberts, Judge James Boasberg, Judge Beryl Howell, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, and in small print below, hosted in partnership with Middle Temple UK. Funding support from Open Society Foundations. Her breath hitched. George Soros. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a statement. She dropped the sheet onto her desk like it was laced with poison. The Middle Temple wasn't just a law guild. It was a global nexus of legal influencers, long known for blurring the boundaries between national law and foreign agendas. And now, the Chief Justice of the United States was sitting at their table. Her mind raced. Jasmine had built her entire career fighting for the voiceless, the discarded, the unseen. Now she held undeniable proof that the very guardians of the Constitution were partnering with outside forces, disguised as collaborative engagement. This wasn't an abstract betrayal. It was deeply personal. She had seen families destroyed by verdicts handed down by these very judges. Now she saw who was pulling their strings. And the most chilling part? No one was saying a word. A memory hit her like a steel door. A young mother Jasmine once represented, deported because a federal judge declined to review her appeal. That judge's name? On this list. Her grip tightened. She hadn't clawed her way through the elite, whitewashed halls of corporate law, past Capitol Hill back doors and courtroom ceilings made of glass and contempt, just to watch the American bench be sold off to the highest global bidder. This wasn't about left or right. It was about independence, integrity, survival. She picked the page up again, slowly this time, and examined the Middle Temple emblem. A lion wrapped around a sword. They weren't hiding. They just assumed no one would ever dare confront them. But Jasmine would. She knew she couldn't tackle this alone. This wasn't just a legal loophole. It was an empire of silence, built over decades and protected by robes, rituals, and rank. She needed people who didn't look away when the truth got messy. People who had been to the edge of the system and come back stronger. Her first call went to Caleb Moran, a retired federal investigator known for uncovering rot in places watchdogs feared to tread. He once exposed a human trafficking ring inside a government contracting firm and nearly died for it. Jasmine found him right where she expected, off-grid in a West Virginia cabin where bullets moved faster than Wi-Fi. "I've got something," she said. "Worse than DHS." Caleb didn't ask for details. He just said, "Send the coordinates." Next up, Mara Jensen, a former DOJ legal strategist whose mind operated like a chessboard, always 10 moves ahead. Mara had crafted regulatory language that crushed multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical deals. She didn't just read law, she dissected it. They met at a roadside diner off Route 29, the kind of place where the waitresses had sleeve tattoos and didn't ask for names. Over burnt coffee, Jasmine dropped the words Middle Temple. Mara's spoon froze mid-stir. "You're targeting them?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Jasmine nodded. "I'm not just targeting them. I'm blowing the door off its hinges." Mara leaned back. "Then you'll need one more weapon." That weapon was Rachel Cortez, a firebrand prosecutor suspended once for calling a federal judge a disgrace to the robe on the record. She never retracted it. Rachel had taken down corrupt city officials, crooked judges, even her own former mentor. When Jasmine called, Rachel was already tracking the whispers about Roberts. "You don't have to convince me," she said. "I've been waiting for someone with a spine." She arrived in D.C. within 36 hours, carrying only a leather briefcase and a burner phone. Their first meeting took place in the basement of a defunct Federal Records Center. No power, dust everywhere. Perfect. One table. For chairs, Jasmine placed the list at the center. "This isn't a conspiracy theory," she said. "It's a coordinated influence operation." Her voice sliced through the still air like a gavel. The silence cut like a blade. Caleb scanned the list and muttered, "These aren't fringe players. This is the core circle." Mara nodded, already cross-referencing data on her laptop. Rachel leaned in. "So, what's the strategy?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "We don't leak. We don't posture. We build. We strike. And when we do, they won't even know what hit them." Each of them understood the magnitude of the enemy they faced. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about entrenched power cloaked in the appearance of honor. Judges with lifetime appointments and unshakable insulation. The system hadn't been designed to allow reform. It was engineered to crush those who dared to question it. And yet, Jasmine felt a strange calm washing over her, because for the first time she wasn't shouting into the void. She had allies, a command center, a clear target. Somewhere within the cold marble halls of justice, the empire had started to quiver, and it hadn't even seen the storm brewing. The proof trickled in slowly, like venom dissolving in a glass of water. First, just stray articles, flight schedules, casual mentions in legal symposium pamphlets. But the deeper the team dug, the clearer the pattern became. And it wasn't just alarming, it was radioactive. Dozens of federal judges had discreetly accepted invitations to speak at lavish international conferences, events underwritten by organizations with unmistakable ideological agendas. The venues were always the same: Geneva, Brussels, London, each location hosting summits on legal innovation under lofty titles like post-national jurisprudence or cross-border justice. Behind the podium stood academics linked to think tanks bankrolled by millions from George Soros's Open Society foundations. And sitting in the front rows, American judges nodding along. But the true danger wasn't where they went. It was what they did once they returned. Jasmine's team started cross-checking flight data and symposium dates with significant court decisions. The overlap was staggering. Weeks after attending a conference in London, Judge James Boasberg issued a ruling blocking a critical national security directive intended to strengthen border control. 2 months following a private session hosted by a UN-affiliated legal group, Judge Beryl Howell extended pretrial detention for January 6 defendants, using terminology that mirrored the keynote speaker's language almost word for word. It was as if the verdicts were rehearsed abroad and delivered on home soil. And this wasn't just optics. It was foreign ideology parading as judicial professionalism. These judges weren't interpreting American law. They were importing globalist doctrines. Jasmine sat before the evidence wall, an entire room covered in red thread, photographs, citations, and timestamps, and felt a slow, burning fury ignite in her chest. "These aren't random rulings," she said quietly. "This is orchestration. They've built a pipeline," Mara said flatly, typing as her screen pulsed with matching legal language. "Concepts born in Europe, refined in think tanks, and funneled directly into U.S. courtrooms under the banner of judicial modernization." "It's more than bias," Caleb added. "It's infiltration." Rachel didn't speak. She simply stared at a photograph. Justice Roberts smiling beside an EU commissioner known for pushing open border migration policies. To Jasmine, the betrayal wasn't about political leanings. It was about the real lives crushed beneath those robes. She remembered veterans denied basic VA assistance while asylum cases were prioritized. She recalled rural landowners stripped of property after federal judges invoked environmental directives inspired by UN climate law panels. This wasn't theoretical. It was human suffering enabled by those sworn to defend the Constitution, not edit it. They've waged war on national sovereignty, Jasmine whispered, and they think no one will stand against them. But they miscalculated. Jasmine wasn't observing anymore. She was preparing to strike. Still, scattered clues weren't enough. She needed to expose the full structure, every gear, every lever, every concealed operator behind the illusion of justice. So they started to chart it. They occupied a long-forgotten briefing room buried in the DOJ's lower floors. Windowless, cold. Its concrete walls once held Cold War secrets. Now it was the center of their counteroffensive. Jasmine stood in front of a whiteboard that had morphed into a living web of betrayal. Red string crisscrossed photos, pushpins, and pages ripped from symposium brochures. At the heart of it all, Chief Justice John Roberts, his picture circled in red ink. Around him radiated a network, judges, academics, foreign institutions, and funding streams. Like arteries sustaining a beast. Every name had a connection. Every dollar was accounted for. Every ruling tracked. Caleb hunched over a second board, this one built solely from court rulings and legal opinions. He'd spent weeks sifting through over 1,000 federal decisions, correlating them with judges who had attended global legal forums. The numbers hit like hammer blows. 312 federal judges had taken part in foreign-sponsored symposiums. 114 had gone more than once, and nearly 70% of them had delivered rulings that weakened U.S. border enforcement, limited surveillance powers, or undercut executive authority, all in the name of international alignment. The data wasn't just disturbing, it was damning. Mara projected a digital diagram onto the wall, sleek, sterile, and horrifying. The flow began with Middle Temple and its bankroll, $4.2 million from Soros-backed entities over a decade. From there, the money flowed into lecture circuits, speaker fees, and luxury judicial retreats. Those retreats birthed policy suggestions, which then re-emerged almost verbatim in federal court decisions. She pointed to 3 pivotal rulings, authored by different judges, but all citing the same obscure legal paper presented at a London conference. "They're not writing judicial opinions," Mara said. "They're executing an agenda." Rachel dropped a fresh folder onto the table. "Judge Howell," she said, just 3 days after handing down the maximum sentencing recommendation for January 6th, she received an Inns of Court Civic Duty Award at a closed-door event in Brussels. Jasmine didn't react. "Do we have proof of her being there?" Caleb nodded. "We've got her flight records, Department of Justice PDM filings. There's even a photo. She's smiling, champagne in hand, standing next to a former U Justice Commissioner." Jasmine's jaw tightened. And yet she claims impartiality. The hypocrisy wasn't theoretical, it was systemic. And now it was undeniable. They began printing the images, hundreds of them. Judges shaking hands with foreign diplomats. Panels showcasing U.S. justices beside activists who publicly decried the Constitution as obsolete. One photograph showed Chief Justice Roberts seated beside a man who had once openly advocated for dissolving U.S. sovereignty in favor of a global legal consensus. Rachel jabbed her finger at the image. "That's not diplomacy. That's indoctrination." Jasmine leaned back, her eyes sweeping across the wall of evidence. "They've constructed a second judiciary," she said softly, "hidden in plain view, funded from overseas, operating without any oversight." She thought of those who never had a chance. The Arizona small business owner fined into bankruptcy after a judge cited international climate policies. The soldier whose deployment was blocked after a court invoked a transnational ethical code that contradicted U.S. military strategy. These weren't isolated incidents. They were calculated moves, falling like dominoes, part of a larger design meant to dismantle national sovereignty piece by piece. And the worst part? The robed elite smiled through it all, as if they were the ones saving the world. Jasmine clenched her fists. "They think the robes make them untouchable." She turned to her team. "Let's remind them who they serve." The picture was now complete, and it was far worse than Jasmine had ever envisioned. This wasn't disorganized misconduct. It was an orchestrated network embedded within the very top of the American judicial system. And now that the web had a name at its center, John Roberts, there was only one thing left: confront it head-on. The room was small, windowless, lined with dull wood paneling and the thick, silent weight of consequence. It wasn't the main Senate hearing chamber, but it didn't need to be. Power didn't always demand a spotlight. The Judiciary Subcommittee on Judicial Ethics sat around a long oak table, each member equipped with a tablet, a pen, or a poker face sharpened by years in Washington. Jasmine Crockett stood at the head, flanked by 2 aides, but entirely alone in the ways that mattered. Across from her sat lawmakers she had once lobbied for civil rights reform. Now looking at her like she was a live grenade, the pin halfway pulled. She knew exactly what she was doing. She also knew the cost. She didn't start with greetings. She opened a black folder and laid it flat on the table like a blade. "I'm here to formally request an independent ethics investigation into Chief Justice John Roberts," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. One senator arched a brow. Another scoffed under his breath. Jasmine didn't waver. She pressed on. "We have verified links between Justice Roberts and foreign-funded legal organizations, including the Middle Temple in London, which has received over $4 million from George Soros-affiliated groups." The name Soros dropped like ice into the room. A few staffers exchanged glances. The mood shifted. She stepped forward, handing the committee clerk a sealed binder. Inside, you'll find flight manifests, event attendance confirmations, donation trails, and analysis linking rulings to specific international legal affiliations. Justice Roberts has presided over or influenced decisions that closely mirror the positions of foreign judicial advocacy organizations to which he maintains undisclosed connections. A senator from New York leaned in, his voice skeptical. "You're suggesting foreign influence at the highest level of our court?" Jasmine didn't blink. "No, Senator. I'm stating it." A collective gasp moved through the room. Even the most seasoned aides sat up straighter. It wasn't just the content of her accusation. It was the conviction behind it. The unmistakable tone of someone who had already walked through fire and come out the other side. Senator Marcus Green, a war hero turned constitutionalist, cleared his throat. "You realize what you're proposing could break the public's trust in the Supreme Court." Jasmine's gaze was like steel. What's more dangerous, losing trust in the institution, or realizing it never deserved that trust in the first place? The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy. She let it linger, like a verdict no one could contest. Then she added, "This isn't about politics. It's about preservation. We don't allow our generals to attend private events funded by foreign governments. Why are we tolerating it from our judiciary?" Someone shifted in their seat. Another swallowed too fast, coughing softly. The tension was thick, because they all understood what she had just done. Jasmine wasn't merely accusing Roberts. She had struck a match beneath the marble pillars of the entire judicial structure, and the fuse was already lit. One senator made a final attempt to deflect. "These are grave allegations. But where is your smoking gun?" Jasmine cut him off. "I have the gun. I have the smoke. And if you choose to ignore this, the American people will know exactly who valued silence over sovereignty." She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Outside the hearing room, reporters prowled like wolves behind velvet ropes. Jasmine stepped out without a word, her expression unreadable. Cameras flashed. Microphones lunged forward. But she just kept walking, heels echoing against the marble floor like a ticking clock counting down to something unstoppable. For the first time in decades, the Supreme Court wasn't untouchable. And Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. Jasmine didn't merely accuse, she revealed. As the Senate subcommittee sat immobilized in heavy silence, she reached into her leather case and pulled out a plain black flash drive. No flair, no theatrics, just facts, cold, hard, and irrefutable. "You want evidence?" she said, her voice sharp and steady, slicing clean through the room like a scalpel. "Let's start with his own words." She plugged the drive into the panel's central console. The screen behind her lit up, not with speculation or rumor, but with a genuine internal email from the Chief Justice himself. The room leaned forward. Jasmine read it aloud. "If American jurisprudence is to endure, it must adapt. Rigidity must yield to international consensus. Gasps sliced through the silence like breaking glass. The email had been buried within a set of redacted FOIA documents, overlooked by oversight but recovered by her team's digital forensic experts. It was signed, time-stamped, and authenticated. A senator cleared his throat, preparing to interrupt, but Jasmine didn't let the moment slip. She tapped another key. A second screen opened, displaying a transcript stamped confidential. "This," she said, "is from a keynote address delivered by Chief Justice John Roberts at the Global Judiciary Convergence Forum in Brussels 2 years ago. A closed event. No media. No public access." Then the voice. His voice. Calm, measured, and professorial, like reading bedtime scripture. "The duty of the modern judge is not to serve the people, but to serve the system." The words hit like a bomb. Jasmine turned toward the panel. Not with anger, but with resolve. "That is not a judicial philosophy," she said. "That is ideological betrayal. That is the voice of someone who's forgotten his oath, not to a system, but to a constitution." She allowed the silence to return, heavy and dense. Then she added, "This is not a theory. It's documented, verified, and entirely incompatible with the principles this court was created to protect." A senator to her right leaned toward his microphone, his tone caught between shock and dread. "You're suggesting the Chief Justice of the United States has embraced foreign legal ideology?" Jasmine turned to him deliberately. "No," she replied. "I'm proving it." Behind her, the screen changed again, this time showing calendar entries and guest lists. Roberts had attended several overseas judicial summits, many of them funded by organizations with deep financial connections to Soros-backed entities. "These aren't coincidences," she said. "They're coordinates." While the senators struggled to regain their footing, Jasmine pressed forward. "This isn't about party lines. It's about integrity, about a legal system being rewritten in secret while the American public is told it's justice." She paused, letting that truth sink in. "It's not justice," she continued, "when court rulings mirror talking points from foreign conferences. It's not impartiality when the man in the highest robe of the land pledges allegiance to a system over the people he swore to represent." The room didn't explode, it cracked. Whispers spread. Glances flickered. Realization crept in like a slow-moving fault line. Jasmine hadn't just crossed a boundary. She had redrawn it. The first to push back was Senator Ella Whitmore of Massachusetts, long viewed as an institutionalist. She leaned into her mic, her voice sharp as splintered ice. "This isn't oversight," she said. "It's a partisan attack dressed up as ethics." She pointed her pen toward Jasmine. "You're turning justice into a political weapon. That's dangerous." Jasmine didn't flinch, but she could feel it. The tension in the room had shifted. The air had grown dense, charged with resistance. Senator Holloway from Illinois, typically a centrist, nodded in agreement with Whitmore. "What precedent are we setting?" he asked. "If every judge who attends a conference abroad becomes a target, you're setting fire to the entire bench." Others joined in, some murmuring disapproval, others speaking openly. One dismissed the effort as a coordinated right-wing smear. Another accused Jasmine of being a media opportunist in a prosecutor's coat. The words stung, not because they were accurate, but because they were crafted to deflect from the truth she had laid bare. Still, a few voices rose above the noise. Senator Marcus Green, gruff, battle-tested, and fiercely loyal to the Constitution, swiveled slowly in his chair. He scanned his colleagues and said, "You all saw the same documents I did. And if your biggest concern right now is political fallout, rather than judicial integrity, then maybe you belong at that witness table yourselves." A hush fell. Jasmine turned toward him, grateful, but unreadable. She couldn't afford to show emotion, not when the knives were already drawn. Across the room, Senator Carla Nean, a rising centrist, spoke with careful resolve. "Whether you approve or not," she said, "this evidence requires a response. To ignore it would be a failure of duty. But for every voice of support, the opposition tightened its grip." Reporters outside began leaking fragments of the hearing onto Twitter. In real time, her investigation was twisted into headlines like Crockett declares war on SCOTUS or revenge politics dressed in legalese. Aides whispered behind clipboards, and cameras flashed from the hallway like silent gunshots. Jasmine stood still, steadying her resolve. She had walked into that room knowing it could become a trap. Now it felt more like a crucifixion. But even as the smears mounted, even as the doubt spread, she refused to flinch. Because the truth, raw, unfiltered truth, was never welcome where power had taken root. The moment she stepped out of the Senate chamber, the storm hit. Flashbulbs exploded like gunfire. Reporters shouted her name from every direction, their microphones thrust forward like bayonets. Jasmine didn't blink. She knew this was coming. You don't accuse the Chief Justice of the United States of betrayal without inviting a media onslaught. Within hours, every major network broke from their scheduled programming. Fox News opened with the headline in bold, crimson font: Jasmine Crockett, defender of the Constitution or last hope for America? Pundits praised her bravery, calling her a patriot, even comparing her to the Founding Fathers. She did what no one else dared, one host said. She drew a line in the sand and said, "Not on my watch." But on the other side of the screen, the knives were just as sharp. CNN labeled her a dangerous populist, waging war on judicial independence. They aired back-to-back segments accusing her of undermining democracy, fanning the flames of institutional collapse, and using the justice system as a political tool. The caption beneath her image read, "Crockett versus the court, crusade or coup?" Panelists debated whether she was courageous or reckless, principled or power-hungry. One legal analyst even accused her of staging the investigation to further her future campaign. They didn't dispute the evidence. They attacked her very existence. She watched it all unfold from a secure room deep inside the DOJ. Screens flickered like a battlefield, her face appearing next to Roberts on every major channel. The nation split clean down the middle. Some called for his resignation. Others demanded her disbarment. Hashtags trended in opposing directions: resign Roberts and jail Jasmine. She had become a symbol, a weapon, target, and still the machine spun on. "They're not after the facts," Rachel said beside her. "They're after the narrative." Jasmine nodded. "And if we lose that," she whispered, "we lose everything." Each hour brought new headlines, fresh distortions, and new lies. Op-eds accused her of politicizing the robes. Talk shows mocked her voice, her hair, and her past clients. Former colleagues distanced themselves with carefully worded statements about respecting the judiciary. Behind closed doors, anonymous sources from the court began leaking counter-narratives, suggesting Roberts had been misunderstood, that Jasmine had twisted his words, and that the entire operation was rooted in partisan revenge. It wasn't a debate anymore. It was a war by broadcast, and Jasmine was at its epicenter. Alone against the echo chamber of power, screaming truth into a storm built to drown it. But while politicians debated and media outlets waged war on the airwaves, the real verdict was already forming in the streets, in the hearts of ordinary Americans who had seen enough. When the people rose, they didn't whisper, they roared. It started with a single voice shouting outside the Supreme Court, defiant, unyielding. Then came dozens, then hundreds. By nightfall, it was thousands across the country. The silence broke like a dam bursting. From D.C. to Dallas, Portland to Pittsburgh, streets flooded with protesters carrying signs painted in black and red. Impeach Roberts. Bring justice back. No foreign judges on American benches. They didn't look like radicals. They were teachers, veterans, factory workers, students. People who never imagined themselves holding picket signs now stood shoulder to shoulder in city squares, demanding the resignation of a man they had once trusted with the fate of the Constitution. News helicopters circled above the Capitol like vultures over a battlefield. Police stood watch, not to contain violence, but to witness a reckoning. Jasmine watched from her office window at the DOJ, the chants rising through the glass like thunder. "This isn't just political anymore," Caleb said beside her. "It's moral." On Twitter, the digital equivalent of an uprising exploded. The hashtag Resign Robert Sword passed 1 million tweets in under 3 hours. Celebrities joined in. War veterans posted testimonials. Constitutional law professors, once silent, began publishing open letters. The movement had a face now, and it wasn't Jasmine. It was everyone who felt betrayed by the robe that once symbolized untouchable justice. Still, for every voice calling for truth, there were others doubling down on denial. Counter-protesters emerged, holding signs like, "Stand with Roberts," "Don't politicize the gavel." Cable networks split the screen between dueling rallies. In one, a grandmother from Michigan wept as she shouted, "My son died in Afghanistan for the Constitution. Don't you dare sell it out." In the other, a think tank lawyer insisted Jasmine was fabricating a scandal to satisfy her own ambition. The divide wasn't just political, it was spiritual. One side believed justice was sacred, the other believed it was theirs to control. Jasmine stood at the center of that fault line, not because she wanted to, but because the truth had dragged her there. She didn't speak to the cameras. She didn't tweet. She watched, and in watching, she saw the cost of standing alone. They called her a hero. They called her a traitor. They called her every name except what she truly was. A woman carrying the weight of a broken system on her shoulders. One truth at a time. The committee room may have gone silent, but outside its doors, the walls were already groaning under the weight of the truth. Jasmine had cracked open the first fissure. But if they were going to bring down a fortress, they would need a wrecking ball. It arrived. The next day, small enough to fit in her palm, yet powerful enough to fracture the entire judiciary. It arrived. No name, no warning. Just a thin manila envelope, hand-delivered by an intern who had no idea what he was carrying. Jasmine took it in silence. No postmark, no return address. Only the faint scent of stale printer ink and the unmistakable weight of danger. Inside was a plain black USB drive. No labels, no encryption, just a sticky note attached in hurried handwriting. "Play this somewhere safe. You don't know the half of it." Her pulse quickened. She had seen setups before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't staged, it was desperate. It was the kind of thing sent by someone with everything to lose, someone on the inside. She locked the door behind her and plugged the drive into a secure DOJ terminal. No folder, no interface, just a single file, Roberts Brussels Conference Audio.web. She hit play. The sound was grainy, but the voice was unmistakable, calm, controlled. Chief Justice John Roberts, recorded at what the metadata confirmed was a closed-door judicial retreat in Belgium. Jasmine leaned in, her stomach sinking with each word. "If we want law to survive the 21st century, we must embrace the harmonization of judicial standards. American law cannot remain an island. It must yield to global consensus, to shared frameworks, to progress." The final sentence rang out like a bullet. Constitutional loyalty is a romantic ideal. Judicial pragmatism is our duty. She froze. It wasn't just ideology. It was betrayal, spoken aloud to a foreign audience under no duress. She opened the next file. A memo, unredacted, with DOJ letterhead and marked confidential. Internal use only. The subject line read, "Judicial Nomination Vetting Guidelines, Global Legal Alignment Criteria." It listed talking points, highlighted recommendations, and had a handwritten annotation in the margin. Discussed with JR after Brussels event. Prioritized candidates open to cross-border judicial norms. The initials weren't speculation, they were confirmation. John Roberts hadn't just attended the event. He had brought the ideology home and quietly steered the bench to align with it. Jasmine stepped back from the screen, the weight of it pressing against her chest like a steel beam. This was no longer about patterns or inference. This was direct involvement. A Supreme Court Chief Justice shaping the future of American law based on conversations in back rooms, halfway across the world. "He's not just compromising," she whispered. "He's coordinating." Rachel burst through the door moments later, breathless. "What is it?" Jasmine turned the screen towards her. "It's the bullet," she said, her voice cold, steady. "We just found the shot that proves the wound." The committee had heard her demands, but Jasmine knew words alone weren't enough. not in a system designed to bury truth behind decorum. So, she took the next step. She went public, and this time she brought the evidence with her. At exactly 9 a.m., the press room at the Department of Justice became ground zero for a national reckoning. Reporters packed in, shoulder to shoulder. Political analysts, foreign correspondents, law professors turned pundits, all waiting, restless, buzzing with rumors. No one knew exactly what Jasmine Crockett was about to unveil, but after weeks of mounting tension, everyone could feel it in their bones. Something irreversible was coming. Jasmine stood behind the curtain, calm but electric, dressed in a black suit that looked less like a uniform and more like armor. She hadn't come to speculate. She had come to expose. The moment she stepped forward, the flashes ignited. The podium stood bare except for a single item. A sealed binder, stamped with the DOJ crest, thick as a legal tombstone. Behind her, the screen lit up in deep crimson with 5 words that would soon burn across every headline in the country. The Shadow Bench. Official DOJ report on judicial compromise. She spoke without pleasantries. Today is not about rumors or partisanship. Today is about proof. Her voice was composed, but the edge was unmistakable. This report is 300 pages of rigorously cross-referenced data detailing a pattern of foreign ideological infiltration into the highest levels of the American judiciary. And it names names. She turned the binder around so the cameras could catch the title inside. Within this document are detailed records of 117 federal judges who have attended foreign-funded judicial symposiums, legal retreats, and closed-door strategy sessions, many of them sponsored by organizations with stated goals of replacing national legal sovereignty with transnational doctrine. She flipped to a marked page and held it up. Among those listed, Judge Barl Howell, Judge James Boasberg, Judge Amit Ma, and Chief Justice John Roberts. A ripple of gasps swept through the room like tremors before an earthquake. The screen behind her changed, now showing a spreadsheet with columns. Name, date, host organization, funding amount. Jasmine continued. In total, $6.4 million was traced through honorariums, research fellowships, travel stipends, and advisory board payments. None of this was disclosed to ethics oversight committees. None of it was transparent to the public. She paused, letting the figures burn into the audience's minds. This is not a case of a few rogue engagements. This is an ecosystem of influence cultivated for years. Then came the moment no one expected. She reached beneath the podium and removed a DOJ evidence pouch, holding it up for all to see. "This device," she said slowly, "was delivered anonymously to my office. On it is a covert recording, audio of Chief Justice John Roberts speaking at a private judicial summit in Brussels. The voice has been authenticated by 3 independent forensic labs. I will now read a direct quote from that recording." She unfolded a printed transcript. "American law must yield to international consensus. The role of the judge is not to defend the people, but to preserve the system." The silence in the room was suffocating. "And it doesn't end there," Jasmine pressed on. "This USB also contains a confidential internal memo authored at the Federal Judicial Center, outlining vetting procedures for judicial nominees. Among its recommendations, prioritize judges open to international legal frameworks and deprioritize those excessively devoted to constitutional literalism." The screen behind her now displayed the memo, handwritten notes, policy headers, and in the corner, 2 initials. "JR. You are seeing this live," she said. "The Supreme Court is not simply drifting. It is being steered. This memo confirms that judicial appointments have been quietly filtered based on ideological loyalty to a global legal philosophy, not to the U.S. Constitution." She placed both the USB and the printed memo on the podium. "This is not theoretical. This is operational. This is organized." A journalist from the Washington Post stood, voice trembling. "Are you accusing the Chief Justice of coordinating judicial subversion?" Jasmine's eyes locked with his. "No," she replied. "I'm proving it." Then she pointed to the title on the screen. "The Shadow Bench is no longer a theory. It is a network. It is real, and today it is exposed. The room erupted. Flashes, shouted questions, frantic calls to offices across Capitol Hill. Some reporters scrambled to download the full report, which had just gone live on the DOJ site. Others stood frozen, stunned. Jasmine turned back to the cameras. This report has now been delivered to every sitting member of Congress, every federal ethics board, and every state Supreme Court. It will be distributed in full to the American public within the hour. She stepped away from the podium, leaving the report, the memo, and the USB behind, like evidence at a crime scene. As she walked off the stage, the flashbulbs followed her into the hallway. Her face was unreadable, her steps deliberate. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett was not just a prosecutor. She was the catalyst for the greatest judicial reckoning in modern American history. As the pages of the shadow bench sparked outrage across the nation, the walls of the Supreme Court began to close in. And in the silence that followed, one man found himself at the center of the storm: Chief Justice John Roberts, with nowhere left to hide. The chamber was empty. His clerks had gone quiet. The doors had been shut for hours. John Roberts sat alone at his desk, hands trembling slightly, staring at the muted television screen in the corner. Jasmine Crockett's press conference was looping again, her voice transcribed across the bottom in closed captions like a eulogy. The words international alignment, ideological bias, and unconstitutional coordination seemed to flicker in and out like the tolling of a bell. He had watched it 5 times, maybe 6. Each time, it hollowed him out a little more. On the desk in front of him lay the memo, his own handwriting, his own initials. There was no spinning it anymore, no controlling the narrative. He picked up his phone, hands still unsteady, and dialed a number only a handful of people in the country ever used. When the line clicked open, he spoke slowly. "Ketanji, it's John." There was a pause, then a low, tired breath on the other end. "I was expecting your call," said Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, her voice flat. Not angry, not comforting, just heavy. John swallowed. "I think I can survive this," he said. "Ride it out, let the storm pass, keep the court steady. This will blow over. It always does." The silence that followed was longer this time. Then her voice, sharper now, sliced straight through him. "No, John, it won't. And it shouldn't." He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "This isn't a scandal. This is a breach. You didn't just attend conferences. You shaped outcomes. You built a shadow court and kept it cloaked in credibility." He turned toward the darkened window. The reflection of his own face was barely visible beneath the faint flicker of the TV behind him. "I was trying to modernize the institution," he muttered, his voice cracking. "The world is changing. The law has to keep up." Her tone turned icy. "Then you should have run for office, not worn the robe." He didn't respond. He didn't have to, because deep down he knew she was right. All the subtle denials, all the private rationalizations, the quiet manipulations under the banner of progress. They were lies he told himself to justify what he'd become. A reformer, a ruler, one who thought he could bend justice without ever breaking it. Justice Jackson's voice softened, but only slightly. "You have one choice left. That's still yours, John. One moment to show the country that the institution matters more than the man." He was silent for a long while, then barely above a whisper. "I never thought it would end like this." She responded without hesitation. "It hasn't ended, but your role in it has." The line went dead. John sat there a moment longer, then reached for the statement he had prepared weeks ago, never intending to use it. He scratched out the final sentence and rewrote it by hand. "Effective immediately, I resign from my position as Chief Justice of the United States." He signed it with the pen that had once sworn him in, and as he placed it gently in the center of the desk, he finally understood. This wasn't surrender. It was the closest he could come to redemption. The next morning, the Supreme Court building stood under a gray Washington sky, its marble steps slick with mist, its columns casting long, grim shadows. Reporters gathered early, more silent than usual, as if the building itself had begun mourning something it couldn't yet name. At exactly 7 a.m., a podium was wheeled to the foot of the stairs. There were no banners, no seals, no introductions. Just a single microphone and a man who, for nearly 2 decades, had worn the most powerful robe in American law. John G. Roberts stepped into view, his face pale, eyes sunken, his black overcoat whipping slightly in the breeze. In the morning wind, he didn't smile, didn't blink. He simply unfolded a single sheet of paper and began to speak. "I have spent my life defending the institutions of this republic," he said, his voice low but unmistakably his. "And for many years, I believed that by guiding the court into the future, I was preserving its strength." He paused, almost visibly choking on the next line. "But preservation cannot come at the cost of trust, and leadership cannot hide behind silence." The cameras zoomed in. Every major network had cut to the live feed. Even foreign news channels ran subtitles in real time. Then came the sentence the nation had waited for. "Effective immediately," he said, "I am resigning as Chief Justice of the United States." The air left the plaza in one breathless exhale. He looked up at no one in particular, just straight ahead into the void he himself had helped create. "The integrity of this court is more important than any single man, including me." He folded the paper, placed it on the podium, and stepped back. No questions, no farewell tour, no defense of his legacy, just resignation, swift and surgical. As he turned to walk up the steps, no one applauded, no one booed. Even the wind seemed to still. What he had done could not be undone, but what he had chosen in the end, to leave rather than fight, was the final admission that Jasmine Crockett had been right. Inside the building, the justices watched in silence. Clerks stood frozen in the hallways. Staffers cried in corners. And far from the court, in homes, schools, and city squares across the country, millions stared at their screens. Not with joy, not with vengeance, but with the stunned weight of consequence. One of the most powerful men in American history had fallen. Not to scandal, not to blackmail, but to truth. And truth, at long last, had prevailed. The marble rotunda of the Capitol had never felt heavier. Inside the Senate chamber, the tension wasn't just political, it was historical. For weeks, the nation had spiraled in the wake of Chief Justice Roberts' resignation. The report on the shadow bench had become both a symbol of reverence and revulsion. Protests outside federal courts, governors calling for independent reviews, civil society groups demanding accountability. But this wasn't chaos, it was reckoning. And Congress, under more pressure than it had faced in decades, was finally forced to act. At 8:17 a.m. on a brisk Thursday morning, the Senate floor buzzed with an urgency usually reserved for declarations of war. Cameras weren't just pointed at the dais, they were mounted like witnesses to a confession. Senator Marcus Green, flanked by a rare bipartisan coalition, stepped up to the microphone. His voice was slow, weathered by years of watching the system decay from within. "This is not about Jasmine Crockett," he began. "This is about the Republic, about the black-robed shield we all believed would stand between justice and corruption, and what happens when that shield is sold." He paused before continuing. "Today, we introduce the Judicial Integrity and Sovereignty Act, legislation designed to ensure that this nation's judges never again answer to anyone but the Constitution." And the room erupted. The bill, spanning 137 pages, was bold, surgical, and unflinchingly clear in its purpose. Section 1 banned all federal judges, Supreme Court and lower courts alike, from accepting any foreign-sponsored gifts, honorariums, travel stipends, speaking fees, or ceremonial awards from non-domestic entities.
No exceptions.
Not even for so-called cultural exchanges. Any violation would trigger a mandatory investigation and immediate suspension pending review. The language was aggressive and intentionally so. America's courts were no longer sacred by assumption. They had to earn that title again. Section 2 was even more seismic. The formation of a National Judicial Ethics Commission, an independent oversight body empowered with investigative authority, subpoena power, and a mandate to conduct real-time audits of all federal judges. Funded by a protected congressional budget line and staffed by former prosecutors, ethics scholars, and bipartisan appointees, this commission would serve as a permanent watchdog. For the first time in modern history, The judiciary itself would be under continuous ethical surveillance. No more cloaked dinners. No more silent retreats in foreign resorts. No more back-channel nominations. Only accountability. As the legislation was read aloud on the floor, cameras zoomed in on the language, highlighting terms like proactive compliance, foreign influence, nullification, and constitutional loyalty certification. Reporters tweeted out excerpts in real time. Civil liberties groups, long skeptical of government intervention, voiced rare approval. Finally, one post read, "We're not just trusting judges, we're verifying them." But not everyone cheered. Inside the chambers, a minority coalition led by Senator Elaine Whitmore called the bill judicial overreach in disguise. She accused Jasmine of orchestrating a coup against the courts. Her speech was passionate but fell flat, because outside those walls, the people had already made up their minds. They had seen the documents, heard the audio, watched the institutions tremble. The court had not been destroyed by politics. It had been cracked by truth. And now that crack was being sealed with legislation. That same afternoon, the House Judiciary Committee passed its version of the bill, adding even sharper language. It required judges to publicly disclose all affiliations with nonprofit legal societies, including foreign ends of court, and any instance of collaborative policy writing with international advisory bodies. The clause was nicknamed the Crockett Rule on Capitol Hill, a nod to the woman who had made silence impossible. By 6 p.m., the final bill passed. The Senate, with 74 votes in favor, passed the bill. The House followed just hours later, and at 11:42 p.m., in a rare late-night signing ceremony broadcast live by every major network, the president signed it into law. Behind him stood Jasmine Crockett, her expression unreadable, her back straight, hands clasped. Not in celebration, but in consequence. This was not a victory. It was a correction, and she understood the cost. When the ink dried, the law went into immediate effect. The next morning, inboxes across the federal judiciary lit up with compliance orders. Judges were required to submit a complete log of their foreign engagements from the last 10 years. Those who hesitated were flagged. Several withdrew quietly from upcoming cases. 2 resigned before their names could even reach the press. But the commission didn't hesitate. Their first official investigation targeted the Middle Temple American affiliate funding pipeline, and within days, accounts were frozen, backdoors exposed, and grants suspended. What had once been untouchable was now transparent and trembling. Across the country, courtrooms felt different. The American flag didn't just look like decoration anymore. It looked like a promise. News coverage was breathless. The Washington Post ran the headline, "From Jasmine's Files to Federal Law, How One Voice Rebuilt the Bench." Fox News called it, "The Day the Judiciary Was Put on Trial and Lost." Even international outlets took note. The Guardian wrote, "The U.S. Supreme Court may never be the same again." And perhaps that was the point. Still, Jasmine refused interviews. She returned to her office, declining late-night shows, bestseller deals, and party invitations. For her, the fight had never been about headlines. It had been about silence and what breaks when someone dares to speak through it. Her team too scattered to quieter roles. Caleb returned to intelligence work, Rachel joined the Ethics Commission, and Mara went back to academia, teaching her students that justice isn't fragile. It's just rarely defended with enough fury. That week, as the sun set over Washington, a new plaque was quietly installed outside the commission's headquarters. It bore no names, just 6 words etched into steel. "No one is above the bench." In the heart of London's legal district, the ancient halls of the Middle Temple stood as they had for centuries. Proud, cloaked in tradition, and shrouded in quiet power. But on this day, its stone walls didn't echo with ceremony. They trembled with consequence. Just after 2 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, an unmarked envelope arrived at their headquarters, bearing a seal none of them had expected. The United States Department of Justice. Inside were just 2 pages, simple, surgical. One line was highlighted in red. Effective immediately, all formal partnerships, funding agreements, and academic exchanges between the Middle Temple and U.S. judicial entities are hereby suspended pending further investigation. Panic spread like wildfire through the corridors. Emails flew, Phones lit up, and staffers whispered behind oak doors carved long before America was even a nation. A statement was hastily drafted but never released, because there was nothing to deny. Jasmine Crockett's investigation had not only exposed American judges, it had pulled back the curtain on their hosts. For years, Middle Temple had operated under the veil of elite diplomacy, inviting American justices to speak on panels, bestowing honorary titles, and quietly funding travel and accommodations under the guise of legal fellowship. But now it was all unraveling. The partnerships were frozen, their US-based affiliate office shuttered, event invitations revoked. Their transatlantic judicial dialogue had become a diplomatic liability. At DOJ headquarters in Washington, a press release was issued with surgical clarity. Due to documented financial entanglements, ideological influence operations, and active coordination with members of the federal judiciary, the Department of Justice has recommended that all American judicial entities sever institutional ties with the Middle Temple until a full ethics and security review is completed. That line hit headlines across the world. The New York Times called it the end of elite judicial diplomacy. The Telegraph ran the simpler headline, Middle Temple blacklisted. In the days that followed, archived footage of American judges speaking at Middle Temple resurfaced. Roberts, Howell, Busberg, all smiling under chandeliers while quoting doctrines foreign to U.S. law. These were no longer harmless sound bites, they were now evidence. Congressional subpoenas followed. Bank records emerged. Investigators found earmarked grants with names redacted, except for one Jr. For years, the temple had operated like a refined fortress of thought leadership. But now it looked more like a pressure valve for soft power influence. The backlash was immediate. Harvard Law suspended its Middle Temple scholarship program. Georgetown pulled out of its legal exchange initiative. The American Inns of Court released a quiet statement, reevaluating its affiliations. The judicial world, once obsessed with tradition and appearances, was now in full retreat. Diplomats squirmed behind podiums. British legal authorities issued vague condemnations, insisting the temple had acted in good faith, but no one was listening. The narrative had changed. Middle Temple wasn't a cultural institution anymore. It was a crime scene without a crime, the epicenter of a silent manipulation campaign that had finally been dragged into the light. And Jasmine? She said nothing. She watched the fall from afar. Her name was now synonymous with a war few dared to fight. Her work was already done. The truth had detonated. The web had unraveled. And for the first time in decades, America's judiciary had closed a door it should never have opened. The Middle Temple stood silent. Its guests had stopped arriving. Its halls echoed not with power, but with the sound of accountability closing in. The air inside the press hall was thick, with too many bodies. There was a sense of something too quiet, as if the end had come before it had even truly begun. The flags behind the podium hung still, untouched by any breeze. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras already rolling. Not for another explosive revelation, not for another scandal, but for something far rarer: clarity. Jasmine Crockett hadn't spoken publicly since John Roberts resigned, since the judiciary reforms passed, and since Middle Temple was expelled from every legal agreement on U.S. soil. She had become a symbol, a crusader for justice, a breaker of silence. But now she stood on the verge of a different kind of decision, and the whole nation had gathered to hear it. She approached the podium with no fanfare, no pre-written title card behind her, no political logos or campaign banners, just the Department of Justice seal, dimly lit under soft lighting. She wore a dark navy suit, understated and sharp. Her eyes didn't shift. They were focused, calm, controlled. A warrior who had endured the fire and now stood not for victory, but for principle. The murmurs quieted. The red lights blinked on. Jasmine began to speak. "I've been asked many times over the past few weeks if I plan to run for office, for leadership, for more," she started, her voice clear, slow, and resonant, like a closing argument. "And I understand why. We live in a country where doing something right, something rare, automatically becomes a springboard. But not every fight is a stepping stone. Some are simply what they are, battles for the soul of something worth defending. She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Let me say this plainly. I will not run for office. I will not be a candidate for anything." Gasps were soft but audible in the room. A CNN producer cursed under his breath. A few stunned reporters stopped typing mid-keystroke. But Jasmine didn't flinch. "I didn't uncover the shadow bench because I wanted a seat at the table," she continued. "I blew it open because the table was rotten. I didn't bring down John Roberts because I wanted the robe. I did it because he had forgotten what it stood for. And I didn't stand before the Senate or the press or the American people to negotiate for power. I stood because silence had become complicity, and I refused to be complicit." Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium, just slightly. "Justice is not a campaign," she said, her tone intensifying. "It is not a slogan, and it is not a currency to be traded for votes or vanity. Justice," she said with fire creeping into her voice, "is not for sale." The room froze. "I have walked through a storm," she said, her voice quieter now, more intimate, "and I saw what happens when power becomes too familiar with itself. I saw judges placing ideology over law, institutions bowing to foreign influence, and a nation so numb to corruption it could no longer recognize betrayal. I did not take down a man. I exposed a system, and systems do not collapse in silence. They scream as they break." She looked directly into the camera. "You ask what I want? I want better laws, better judges, better guardians. I want a nation that doesn't flinch when truth knocks on its door. I want young attorneys who will not be taught that compromise is a virtue when it comes to ethics. And I want citizens to remember that the Constitution is not just a document. It's a boundary. When we forget that, we forget who we are." The applause began softly, reluctantly, respectfully. But Jasmine raised a hand, and the room fell silent again. "This is not a victory tour," she said, her voice low, her cadence deliberate. "This is a warning. The fact that it took one voice, one investigation, and one press conference to cause this much upheaval is not a sign of strength. It's a symptom of how fragile our institutions have become. We should not rely on whistleblowers, leaked audio, or viral hashtags to cleanse our courts. We should have safeguards that work before the damage is done." She stepped back slightly, took a breath, and then delivered her final line with the clarity of a verdict. "I don't want power. I want justice, and justice is not for sale." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, full of weight, full of a nation realizing that it had been spoken to not with rehearsed politics, but with truth raw, righteous, and irrevocable. As she left the podium, there were no handshakes, no embraces, just the soft shuffle of her heels echoing down the corridor behind her. The cameras lingered, but Jasmine never looked back. In the days that followed, political parties begged her to reconsider. PACs offered blank checks. Campaign managers pitched slogans like, "From justice to president," and urged her to finish the fight. But Jasmine answered none of them. She returned to private life, to the shadows from which she had emerged, not as a politician, but as a guardian. And maybe that's how justice should be, loud only when it must be, but never owned by those who crave its power. They never built statues for her. She wouldn't have wanted them. But in classrooms, courtrooms, and even military academies, her name became shorthand for one of the rarest acts in American life. Standing up not just against one man, but against the entire machine. Jasmine Crockett had walked into a fortified institution, exposed its cracks, and left before anyone could offer her anything. A throne she never sought, her courage never turned into a campaign. She didn't weaponize truth for personal advantage. And that refusal, that unwavering discipline to walk away when the world pleaded for her to stay, was precisely what elevated her into something greater than herself. In the months after her resignation speech, murals started appearing on college campuses. One depicted her silhouette beneath the words, "Silence is a choice, so is justice." Law professors revamped their ethics courses to include the Shadow Bench report as required reading. Students memorized the quote she had delivered from the podium like scripture. Justice is not for sale. But it wasn't only the young who invoked her name. Federal judges began referencing her casework, and congressional hearings hailed her tactics as a new gold standard for constitutional integrity. Even whistleblowers in other sectors, Pentagon analysts, corporate fraud investigators, civil rights attorneys, used the phrase in private interviews, "We're pulling a Jasmine." What made her legacy burn so brightly wasn't only what she revealed. It was also what she endured. Behind every headline, every policy shift, and every national awakening, there had been real costs. Death threats, smear campaigns, former colleagues distancing themselves, institutions pretending they never doubted her. When the truth finally came out, there were nights she slept with one eye open and mornings where she checked news apps just to prepare for the next distortion. But she never broke, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't set out to be admired. She had set out to be right. As history moved on, her influence only grew stronger. At the Justice Department, a wing of the National Judicial Ethics Commission was named in her honor, not at her request but by unanimous vote. It became the place where whistleblower reports were reviewed, where judges were vetted, and where future abuses were stopped before they could spread. They called it the Crockett Wing, but among young lawyers, its nickname was simpler: the firewall. Across the world, governments studying American reform stopped asking how the system had failed and began asking how one woman had saved it. She became the subject of lectures at Oxford, a case study at The Hague, and a symbol whispered about in dictatorships where judicial independence had long been non-existent. At one protest outside a foreign court, a young woman held a sign that read, "If Jasmine could do it, so can we." Jasmine never commented. She didn't tweet, didn't publish memoirs. She turned down every speaking tour, every honorary degree, every six-figure advance from publishers begging for a tell-all. Her only reply, "I already said everything that needed to be said under oath." In time, a new generation of leaders rose, many citing Jasmine as their guide. A public defender ran for office on a platform of courtroom transparency and won. A federal judge resigned rather than falsify an ethics disclosure. A young woman in Detroit started a scholarship fund named after the brave, with a single quote framed on the wall, "No robe, no seat, no title is worth your silence." And Jasmine? She watched from afar, never interfering, never reliving. Just one woman who had walked into the darkest corridors of power, struck a match and walked away, knowing the light would burn long after she was gone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.